Welcome, everyone, to the Revolution in the 21st Century Convention. We're coming back after a wonderful day so far of discussions from how to capture the attention of the corporate media and build our own media, how to build assemblies, movements, how to build a modern revolution. It's really exciting work that we're focusing on. This session is called Hope and History in the Face of Collapse. We've got some wonderful speakers who are here today. Human rights activist Peter Tatchell, philosopher and Oxford scholar Bart van Es, who's from actually where I'm based right now in the Wageningen area in the Netherlands, and my fellow co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, Claire Farrell. Well, welcome everyone, and thanks so much for being here. For those who are watching live online, the around 100 to 150 of you, you are very welcome to be part of this discussion. You can ask Q&A questions in the Zoom function. You can also drop reactions in the chat and on the screen so people can see how you're thinking and feeling about the various things that come up. Yes, thank you all so much for coming. I'll pass over to Claire to kick us off.
Thanks, Robin. Yeah, hi, everybody, and thanks so much. I thought it would be beautiful to open a conversation that includes the word hope in the title, which everybody who knows me knows isn't my strongest topic of discussion. Just to reference the work of somebody who I met a little while ago, a wonderful Turkish writer called Etche Temelkuran. And one of the points in her book Together, which I find so useful for trying to sort of explore sort of intellectually, but also like more probably spiritually, what the fuck are we supposed to be doing in this time when we face up to the realities of the climate crisis and systemic breakdown. It's this sort of provocation that she makes that more than needing hope, which has lots of conditions attached to it sometimes, or can be dependent on others, or whatever, is this idea of needing faith, and faith being a thing that you can't have taken away from you in a way that perhaps hope can. And the idea that that's the last thing that's left for us when we're living through extreme circumstances, social breakdown, political complete failure, all kinds of sort of social horror that people might be have experienced in the past and may be anticipating experiencing in a variety of different ways in the near future. And I suppose with that, a lot of my work at the moment, similar to the previous session, if you were listening to that with Gully and others talking about democracy and trying to build stuff from the ground up, has been focused on thinking about new systems and new participatory mechanisms and ways that you can get people really to take part in things and get together and connect, particularly to try and get people to connect across divisions, and to get them to find themselves in a kind of civic engagement, I guess, with one another in a way that our atomized societies under this current sort of culture of late stage kind of neoliberal capitalism is very, very much isolated and separated everybody to the point where people feel very powerless, and to face these enormous challenges as individuals is obviously really, really fucking bad for us, in my view. And one of the main sort of factors of damage that I think is occurring to people who are not necessarily on the front line of physical impacts of climate, but are on the front line of psychological damage and impacts. And so I guess I'm interested in kind of where this conversation might go in terms of thinking through what we can learn from history, what we can think about in terms of how this situation is not like anything else in history in many, many ways as well. And how we can like quickly and consciously and collectively, enthusiastically grow our sort of intelligence from like things that have gone in the past, things that have gone well, things that we've learned from because they didn't go well. And so that's why I'm really excited to have this discussion with you guys, and especially hear from you, Peter, the struggles that you've been involved in. There's obviously like immense volume of learning by doing, which is what I think we in the sort of recent climate movement, certainly Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil and others, I think have been really engaged in this kind of let's learn by trying things and doing it. And sometimes that means you learn by failing. But I'll hand over to you, Peter, and you can come in.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and greetings to fellow 21st century revolutionaries. Thank you for joining us. I think you're absolutely right. In all my campaigning life, stretching now over 58 years, I never really invented much. I listened and learned and studied the people who went before me, the suffragettes, the Chartists, the Black Civil Rights Movement, and many, many others. How did they do it? How did they achieve change? And of course, it's always often a combination of insider work, that is working within institutions or parliaments or other organizations, but also external protest and using protest as a weapon to catalyze consciousness raising, to put people in power and privilege on the spot, to articulate through protest an alternative vision of what society could be. And I think that's really important in this very difficult period we're going through. And I think for me, there are very strong echoes of the 1930s. It's not the same, it's different, but there are some parallels. We are in a time of extreme economic instability. Around the world, national debts are astronomically high, and there's a very substantial risk of financial collapse. That is a real danger. We have a repeat of the financial crisis in 2008, only much, much worse. And then, of course, we have the totally new dimension, which is the climate crisis, which threatens human survival and the total failure of governments around the world to take serious action, even though the clock is ticking. And then again, we also have the rise of the far right, echoing the 1930s, not the same as the 1930s, but the same kind of or similar kind of bigotry and intolerance, and the scapegoating of minorities. We see the scapegoating of immigrants, refugees, Muslims, in some countries, LGBT plus people. We also have wars in Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, the Congo, Sudan, and many other places. We have the rise of rival superpowers. So US hegemony is now being challenged by China and Russia in particular. That represents a very dangerous period, because we know that when superpowers come in contention over economic power, over resources, then things can get. That's how often inter-imperialist wars are triggered. So to me, the fundamental most important thing is we have to find among progressive people the common ground. What are the issues and what are the tactics and methods we can unite on? We can have our differences and disagreements, but it's really important that we unite, because unity is strength. Our mutual solidarity is what gives us power against power and privilege. It gives us a weapon against the far right. And of course, in the 1930s, one of the great problems was the left was often divided between socialists or social democrats and communists and anarchists and so on. That division enabled the far right to gain ground and power. I also think we need to focus on the underlying common issues that affect everyone. So class and class injustice, class privilege, class inequality is an issue that affects people, whatever, black or white, male or female, trans, non-trans, people of faith, of not faith. Class is the great issue which we have in common between the haves and the have-not, between the 1% with power and privilege and the rest of us. And I think we need to focus on those issues. I think it was very interesting how Bernie Sanders, he was a bit misquoted, but he was saying that the focus on identity politics, which I think is very important, he said that perhaps in the presidential election just gone, maybe the Democrats focused too much on identity issues, or at least not enough on class issues, on the cost of living crisis, on the needs of ordinary working class people. Those are the majority in our societies. We need to address their concerns if we want to make progress. We need them as allies together with the trade union movement.
Thanks, Peter. I think that's really interesting. And I mean, I've just been writing something that it's not quite finished yet, but, really reflecting on the sort of individualism that is in our culture and how that became, I think, part of the bedrock of some of the identity politics stuff that has, in, Ash Sarkar's eyes, gone a bit wrong, gone a bit too far, started to divide people rather than unite them and stuff. It's a real sort of moment, I think, of reflection on those things, about how we do want to create a new sort of 21st century solidarity that can work, as well as all understanding our differences and respecting people, and being able to build that respect across all the different types of people in our society. But there is a certain pulling together that seems like it's the main point of the main gap. It's the main sort of place where there's a lack at the moment in terms of people finding that strength. So, Bart, do you want to come in?
Yeah, well, I thought maybe it'd be useful if I kind of introduce myself and what I'm up to. So I am, as Robin said, I'm a professor at Oxford in English literature. And if anybody's heard of me, it's probably through a book I wrote in 2018 called The Cutout Girl, which was the story of my adoptive aunt, who was a Jewish girl in hiding during World War II with my grandparents. And I met her in 2014, ended up writing her story, which ended up being a kind of larger story of resistance in the Netherlands, collaboration in the Netherlands. And that book won the Costa Book of the Year, ended up being, out in 17 languages and sold a lot of copies. But for me also, it gave me a new way of writing. I had been a kind of publishing academic in Renaissance literature and so on. What that book did was kind of twin first-person narration, kind of memoir and travel writing with novelized history. And that for me is a quite powerful way of drawing connections, as I guess Peter's been sort of suggesting as well, between earlier moments. In certain ways, there were kind of parallels in that book between fascism and kind of collapse of democracy, which already felt like, it was under threat in 2018 and still more so now. So after that, it was a bit uncertain what I would do. But I heard of, for me, a really transformative and inspirational conversation on political thinking, actually, where Roger was being interviewed by Nick Robinson. And that's generally this, and it's a very establishment kind of format, really. And the idea there is kind of anybody can come on. So, it's Farage one week and, Roger Hallam the next. But Roger, I think it's the compelling 45 minutes. I urge anybody who's got the time to just look it up on the BBC website, because very early on, Roger says, we can't have this kind of conversation about this. This is not a kind of general chat, because this is about what you are going to do to have integrity in your life, Nick Robinson, because hell is coming and you have failed to act in time. And this is about truth. And this is a group of people who are speaking to eternity. And there's something spiritually transformative to returning to the truth that is always inside yourself, that calls to you. And you have to abandon the idea of pragmatic utilitarian politics to unite yourself with the truth. And he talked very compellingly about the climate crisis, but that wasn't even the main subject of that exchange. I'd been kind of a relatively moderately active Extinction Rebellion member, had gone on protests. We hosted an affinity group in our house, but I wasn't really a kind of in any way a leader of the movement, and still am not. But that interview, it's kind of weird because I come from this kind of world of research and so on. It immediately connected to me with St. Augustine of Hippo, which seems a bizarre kind of connection to make. But St. Augustine of Hippo, founding father of the Catholic Church, who lived in the last days of the Roman Empire, and amongst whose kind of theological insights is this idea of God as truth and absolute truth, and who makes actually this transition, which is a little bit like the movement from being someone rather like Nick Robinson, a person who's fundamentally part of a global elite who is conversant with lots of ways of understanding truth. So Augustine was professor of rhetoric in Milan in the year 384. And he ends up in 430 when he dies as Bishop of Hippo, with the Roman Empire by that point in the West having entirely collapsed. He ends up being somebody, I guess, more like Roger, an absolutist for truth. And there are parts I'm not fully, though I'm a great supporter of what Extinction Rebellion are doing. I think I'm partly coming at this as something of an outsider to the movement. I'd say my politics was quite centrist Labour, while being absolutely sure that the climate crisis changed everything in terms of what politics can do. So anyway, this has resulted in my writing a book which works a little bit like The Cutout Girl in that it twins novelization and memoir to give us a history of the life and thought of Augustine of Hippo, twinned with an account of our present moment of political crisis. And there's been a lot of interest from publishers in the book. So it already has 8 publishers worldwide before it's even been completed. So I'm hoping for quite a large readership for it. So it's got Dutch publishers, German publishers, Italian, French, even a Korean publisher. So the hope is this is a kind of emotionally compelling account of a transformative moment in history and how it changed people's consciousness and changed values around truth. And it's kind of about also the psychological process of being able to deny truth, which Augustine writes about very powerfully. Now, for him, the truth is the truth of Catholic Christianity. But I think it's an analogy that works very well, that Augustine for a long time is still part of an establishment. He wants to be a wealthy, successful, worldly academic, wants to mix with important people, but he's more and more struck that fundamentally he's doing something inauthentic and that a crisis is coming and that he needs to change his life. So that's the book I'm writing. I've been interviewing Roger for that. So those interviews actually feature in the book as well. So I've been to see him in prison a couple of times. And I've sent Roger the first half of the book, and it's now 3/4 done. And I think largely he's happy with it. There are sort of parts of it that he's not happy with. So it's not kind of propaganda for XR. But I think the good thing of that, hopefully, is that I will bring a readership to this book that is not part of the in crowd of kind of XR already. The kind of readership of the Cutout Girl was, for example, quite largely Jewish, quite pro-Israel people. And it got good reviews and things like The Spectator. And so I'm hoping that it's a way of broadening the conversation and challenging people. If I can go to literary festivals, I've certainly already started lecturing on this at Oxford. So anyway, that probably says enough about what I'm doing. But thanks, Claire.
Thank you so much, Bart, and thank you for mentioning Roger. He was hopefully going to call in today from prison, but was stopped by the prison authorities earlier. They came into his cell and said, no, you can't record this message, a short clip for a convention. He's been continually repressed whilst being in prison. He originally wrote a book that had its manuscript taken away from him, 20,000 words. As an author, I'm sure you can well imagine his pain. And but he has, in every way, ever since I've known him, been that determined spirit of rebellion. Whatever curves life throws, he will continue. He will make a podcast from prison, the first of its kind. He will, continue in this. And this kind of resonates for me with the last discussion we were having in the democracy and assembly space, which was very much about the assemblies are just a tool. And very much what people feel we need in this moment is actually a spirit of resistance, a spirit to tell the truth in this very difficult moment. I wondered if anyone else wanted to say any more on that. in this kind of idea of spirit. Yeah, Claire, please.
Yeah, well, I just thought I'd pick up because somebody's just earlier mentioned Bernie Sanders. And I actually went to see him speak last night. A friend had a spare ticket they gave to me. And so I went to Central Hall in Westminster and watched him talk. And one of the things that I think is interesting about this question of the spirit is that I think, a lot of us are sort of feel like the work of nonviolent resistance, the work of like very, very serious campaigning where you pay a high price yourself in order to try and be effective against injustice or on behalf of, the greater picture and the greater good is something that I think a lot of us feel is spiritual work, but perhaps we don't really have the kind of spiritual support systems, vocabulary, community around us to understand it in that way. So we're quite often looking at things in a very materialist frame, which is kind of where most intellectual academic work seems to often rest in particular. And I know that one of the sort of magic source of the work that I put into Extinction Rebellion, certainly with the creative group, was to recognize this sort of the metaphysics that we often don't see in conversations that are just about carbon emissions, just about economic justice, just about sort of numbers that you can push and pull, or is that right or wrong? Is it yes or no? And, this idea that we can come together to have a conversation with each other, which can become like a transformative event for the people involved, but also for the people who are witnessing it, requires some respect for the non-material life that we all have as beings. And that I don't think is factored into our sort of popular culture very much. I just wanted to give a sort of a bit of a sort of recommendation in case people haven't heard of a guy called John Vervaeke, who is an academic who's done a series of, it's the most immense, I haven't listened to them all, but there's the most immense series of YouTube videos, lectures about the meaning crisis, awakening from the meaning crisis. And he goes back to this sort of the ancient times, precisely of like ancient philosophers, and saying that, a lot of what it struck me was being wrestled with in those times was like, yes, a search for truth, but also a search for like practical methods that you could use to stop you from bullshitting yourself, right? Which is like, people are very prone to self-deception. And we are living in an age where it seems like we are systemically deceiving ourselves. And I would say that's kind of what's going on with that conversation on the BBC. People unable to confront the reality of the actual data, the actual information that is before us. And in that way, then feeling like, the sort of pathological bullshit that is like seeps through our communications like systems, our information systems, the media, even in universities. The call I had this morning, which was one of the opening roundtables for this with James Dyke, he said he thinks people in academia who look at Earth system science find it difficult to accept and really study with honesty the reality of how much we have catapulted the Earth system out of one state and into another, and we're living through that change. It's so hard to believe that that is what's happening, and that this civilization cannot and will not continue beyond a certain amount of time. Nobody quite knows the timeline, but they do know that's the fucking case. That is very, very difficult to deal with. And if we are already a species that's like internally prone to like self-deception and basically bullshitting ourselves and each other, then that becomes quite a challenge. And I think there are practical, quite simple things that you can do to try to stop bullshitting yourself. One of them is to have open conversations and a therapist. One of them is to have critical inquiry. One of them is to meet in groups of people to check that you don't just believe a load of old bullshit. There's lots of things that we can do. And when you get down to it, sometimes they're like incredibly simple. Like, we need to get in a room and talk to some strangers. And I think bridging that space between the sort of the big conceptual stuff that I've just sort of wanged on about, which can feel a bit complicated, down to the simplicity of being able to meet and relate and recognize that we don't only have a material life, but we also have feelings too. And that might be quite important where we're headed and where we're sitting. Feels like all of that together is something that I personally am constantly trying to sort of pick apart within myself. And it's why I've started writing stuff down on Substack, because I just want to sort of think out loud about this stuff, because I know that I don't know all the answers, but there's so many of the important sort of facets of what's come at me, mainly through this space, through the climate movement and the people that I've met through it, and the recommendations that I've had through it of things to read, people to listen to, stuff to try and get my head around. So in order to try and sort of help ourselves do this work more quickly, because we are in a bit of a hurry to get our heads straight, that, you know, it feels really important to me that we're sort of opening up space for these kinds of conversations where we're going to say, what is it about faith? What is it about hope? What is it about love? What is, you know, what is it that's going on spiritually for us? Because I do feel like we struggle with it. It doesn't fit easily into our sort of everyday, ordinary culture that's sort of outside my front door.
Thanks, Claire. You're really speaking my language here, and I'm sure for Roger as well, this kind of how do we get beyond the sort of intellectual arguments, you know, going beyond just the climate, you know, the details of the numbers and whatnot, into something much bigger, the spirit of revolutionary change, of really being part of something. Peter, I wonder, as a excellent human rights activist, someone who's really championing humanity in all of its many formats, particularly I respect a lot your work for the queer and trans community. I wonder, how do you see that spirit going forward? Where do you find that spirit?
Well, just picking up on what Claire said, of course, I'm old enough to remember the early days of the gay liberation movement in the early 1970s. I was part of the London Gay Liberation Front, and we had what we called consciousness-raising groups, which were self-selected groups of people who decided to meet together, usually weekly or fortnightly, to discuss not only the campaigns, but also our feelings. You know, how are we coping with the homophobia, the biphobia, the transphobia that was being thrown at us? And, you know, how did we find the last protest? What could have been done better? Where did we succeed? What can we do better next time? And these groups were very, very, I suppose they're a form of, you know, group psychotherapy in a way, but we didn't see it in those terms. But they were very, very, very empowering, very uplifting. And they gave us that sense of solidarity and support that if we were just atomized individuals, we wouldn't have had. So I think that there's something there that, you know, all movements need to consider and think about, because these battles, you know, are sometimes punishing. You know, a lot of us, like Roger and others, have spent long periods in prison, you know, facing false charges by the police and so on. You know, that emotional support is really, really important to sustain people and prevent burnout, because that's one of the biggest problems for any, you know, social movement is people jump in very enthusiastic, but then many soon burn out and then just leave. And that's a loss, that's a suffering for them, but a loss for the movement. So we have to find ways in which we can, you know, deal with that and, you know, and protect against it, protect and value the people in the movement.
Thank you, Peter. It really speaks to me as someone who has burnt out, throwing my life into Extinction Rebellion, dropping out of university, and then being hit with COVID in 2020 and being disabled and largely burnt out by that. I really hear you, how we look after each other in these spaces ahead, hearing the last talk with Cooperation Hull, building the mutual aid groups, building the, you know, the red therapy, they called it, also the kind of, you know, socialists getting together and doing their own therapy groups, or the more modern co-counseling movement, for instance. All of this is so important. I just wanted to give a shout out to the live stream right now. We've got 150 people joined in, both in the session and across the world. Really sparking a lot of discussion and love in the chat and on cross social media. If you can support us in this movement, it'll be really appreciated. I'll put a link in the chat for rev21.earth/support. Regular small donations help keep this movement going. It's how we got this convention started in the first place, was a year ago. Roger started writing from prison. Some people started chipping in to help make sure that happened. And now we have this whole organization. Really, it comes from this grassroots donations and support. So I really wanted to thank everyone who got their ticket through donation and who's donated so far. We've raised over £6,000 so far today. And I'm seeing, a lot of love coming in. So thank you for that. Bart, I wanted to pass back to you on this question of spirit. Of course, you've been looking at some of the big questions around this. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think one of the things that I'm interested in is people's ability to kind of block reality. And there's one of the tracts by St. Augustine that I'm particularly interested in, the first part of the book, a tract called Against the Academics. And it's fundamentally about a problem of a certain kind of elite thinking that it's really about winning arguments, and it's about prestige of certain kinds. It's also a kind of intellectual game. And I think it's something that generally pervades university culture. And so my book is partly about my own experience of lots of extremely well-informed people who very largely do not deny the climate crisis, but are kind of sort of caught in this semi-ironic way of thinking that kind of removes the spiritual from how they think. So they'll speak analytically, but they'll have their little areas, and they kind of consider it part of their integrity in a way is not to take anything too seriously, to have this sort of slightly supercilious removal from emotion. Fundamentally, it's a very atheist kind of mindset. Not that I'm personally a believer in religion, but the mindset is kind of atheistical. And this is a mindset that Augustine is very good at analyzing, because it's the dominant intellectual culture of the late Roman Empire. Most of these people are kind of Platonists. They are extremely learned. They know multiple languages. They don't really get involved. And this is the culture I'm facing continually. And when I start saying, they think it's kind of fine, my colleagues, if I say I'm writing a book on Augustine, and then they might even go, oh, that's quite clever to compare it to Roger Hallam. But then I say, well, I think he's right. This is true. This is comparable. This is really happening. And it's actually not even disputable. This is simply the truth. Then you see this sort of interesting split in kinds of reactions. Some people do then sort of say, my God, you're right. And actually, I'm so conscious of living in this world of lies and how weird my behavior is, in a way, that people sort of jetting around to conferences to discuss, the culture of punctuation in 16th century England or something, and kind of going, why am I still doing that? Why is that my career? But then other people either sort of laugh at it and sort of say, oh, we're all doomed. Or they come to this other terrifying position, which is to kind of say, well, the world is better off without people anyway, and sort of laugh it off. And those are kind of both forms of fundamental spiritual disconnect. And the thing that sparked my connection with Roger was that thing about truth and a kind of elevation that comes from embracing the truth. So it's not necessarily a kind of feel good kind of thing, because the consequences of it are really terrifying. And they were terrifying for Augustine, who's not a straightforward goody in my story either. I mean, Augustine, amongst other things, he's the originator of the doctrine of original sin. When he starts to look at humanity, he is terrified of what humanity is capable of. And a lot of his kind of revolutionary thinking is to kind of have a much more complex form of psychoanalysis, you could almost call it, that sort of thinks about people as being defined by greed and so on. I guess what I'm saying is that a connection with the spiritual can be something quite frightening. It's not, we shouldn't sort of just hope this is, some kind of 70s style feel good, hey, just kind of connect with the vibe. There is something horrific about embracing the truth we are facing. But then I think what Roger is good at saying is, okay, you have to go through that. And it's only paradoxically by sort of going through that moment of crisis where you actually face this reality that you can then sort of move beyond it, and you stop having this kind of incremental model of, oh, I've got to kind of, put this output there, or I've got to win this argument. No, it's about sort of giving up in a way on success in an immediate next 10 minutes kind of way, and just saying, look, let me first have integrity in what I'm doing. And that's the hope that I'm going to be mainly trying to persuade people of. But let's at least just speak the truth to each other. That, we know this is happening, and then let's think about the solutions. I don't know if that's a very good response, but that's where the spirituality to me is about this connection with truth and the devices that people have to block that connection with what ought to be anybody's reaction to the thought of 1 billion people dying and 100,000 species becoming extinct and large parts of the earth being on fire. And yet, people have this amazing ability, of sort of saying, oh, well, yeah, a lot of Greece was burnt down last year, but, I can get a cheap flight to go to Corsica because there haven't been any fires there yet. And a lot of people are just capable of that doublethink. Me included to a certain extent, to stay sane, though I do try to fly anymore. I haven't flown for a long time.
Thank you, Bart. It's an excellent response. You're getting a lot of love in the live stream and the chat. It's a moral quagmire also to be in, and and to come closer to the truth every day is a challenge. And as we do so, we experience more of what it is to be human in this moment, I think. We've had speakers today who've had to cancel from Canada, for instance, because they've also got wildfires firing off right now. The deeper we're in this work, there are a lot of challenges to it. Claire, I wanted to come back to you on this, the championing of the truth. You've been always so good at, just saying it as it is, even in the shittiest of moments. What do you want to add?
Well, a little while ago, maybe about 3-4 weeks ago, I had a really good conversation with Roger, actually, from prison. And it's remarkable to me that you can have like an hour-long chat with someone who's banged up. But we have had some of our best conversations when he's been inside. And one of the things that came up is a very sort of philosophical kind of spiritual focused discussion about what it is that we're trying to strategize to do and how we might go about doing some of it. And we talked a bit about psychic collapse and about the fact that when the glacier collapse, which is in the news just actually I only saw it this morning. These kind of staggering, dramatic, extreme events that happen now in Europe in ways which I think a lot of people in our climate movement felt were things that maybe that kind of scale of drama was happening much further away for the time being, even as it started to come into places like Canada, Australia, English speaking kind of Western, if you like, countries, but still far away from England. You didn't think, oh shit, hundreds of people may be killed by an extreme event that goes bam on a town. Whereas now we're living with that, like feeling like it's an increasing reality for people. And what I have observed over the recent years is definitely that, people in the progressive sort of political space, many of whom were extremely critical of the climate movement over the time when we were sort of spinning it into its, greatest sort of peak of activity in sort of 2018, 19, 2020. Those people who really, a bit like the conversations Roger's had with the BBC, those people who have really sort of failed to grasp the nature of the situation in a physical sense, in a scientific sense, in a system sense, still sort of saying, oh, but it's be all right for rich people. And you say, no, it won't. It won't. It might be okay for one rich person who dies alone in a bunker at the end of the century, but it's not going to be all right for like a lot of rich people. It's not going to be all right for anyone. It's systemically fucked. The idea that there's this sort of moment in approaching us where lots of people who you may think should have been your natural allies politically in terms of justice, preventing harm, recognizing that inequality is like massively bound up with all of this stuff, racism, discrimination, all of it. The fact that they, those people have probably not really admitted to themselves or their sort of base of listeners that the reality of what's going on. me and Roger were talking about this sort of potential for there being this like moment of psychic collapse. And I think about it in terms of, friends of mine as well, who I know will go on a holiday to Europe on a plane and try to hide it from me because they think that somehow they're in trouble with me for doing a thing which I think they know is like spiritually wrong to themselves and to their nieces, their nephews, their whatever. And so this is also a sort of a thing that I wonder whether or not we can prepare for well, which, the idea that people I love are, firstly, that they think I'm going to tell them off for something that, I mean, I really don't have fucking time to tell people off for that. Like, it's not that important. But the point is, like, being able to have a conversation that says this is actually for yourself. Like, who are you and who are you going to be when stuff really starts to fall apart around you and all you can think about is the fact that you never came to the protests, you didn't help, you went on cheap holidays, you kept on eating loads of meat, you bought too many clothes, you did all the things that arguably on one person's level don't make a huge amount of difference, and you can say it's a collective action problem. What's the point in what I do? Blah, 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 whatever. But the point is that you're sort of undermining your own spiritual integrity if you know that you're consistently collaborating in making the situation much, much worse at a time when you really need to be realizing that things should change and that you have to be part of that because everyone has to be. So it's a big question, I think, about how we can prepare ourselves not only to support each other and the people who step into this space, because increasingly people I've met who haven't been looking at this for a long time and go, oh my God, I started working on climate 18 months ago. I used to be a neuroscientist and now I can't sleep at night and I can't look at my 4-year-old. Well, that experience is what people went through at the start of XR. And most people don't know how much sort of grief holding and tending and supportive kind of labor was going on between individuals, which probably Peter knows a lot about. Similar kinds of work that's gone on in other movements to like take care of people emotionally and psychically and spiritually through extraordinarily painful times. But how we can sort of keep on helping people who've only just stepped into that very, very dark place, and they need to be helped to keep on looking at things, otherwise they'll look away. And then also how we're going to cope or help to bring people forwards into a constructive place if and when there is this sort of gradual collapse and cracking of the psychic kind of landscape of people who've been sort of intellectually engaged, but not really admitting to themselves in the head what's happening, but then having almost no apparatus and no practices and no communities to lean on for the problems that it creates for your heart as well. So I think there's quite a lot to be thought through in terms of how we can be compassionate to one another. And in a way, what came up in the call earlier was Leon Simons saying, like, Mother Earth is going to send bigger disruptions into the world than we could create by sitting in a road, right? And that's what's happening. And the disruptions are going to continue to create space. And I don't want to talk about them as opportunities because there's going to be some of them that will be mass death events and they're going to be atrocities. But the point is, when we do disruptive action, it makes space for conversations that wouldn't have had any space had you not undertaken that action. When we look at the level of disruption that is coming, we need to remember that lots of people haven't heard the things that we've been saying for the last 6, 7, 10, 15 years and say them again, and not be worried about the fact that you feel like you've said it before, because hardly anybody has heard anything I've ever said. And I need to remember that. Otherwise, I'll forget to keep on saying the most basic things, which are about the truth, the compassion, and the simplicity of the practical sort of things that I think we need to focus on doing together. I hope that's not too waffly.
No, thank you, Claire. It brings us together. And I think the last one, I want to go to you, Peter, and ask, a question I find also challenging. We're talking about collapse, we're talking about truth, these moments, this huge reckoning that we're facing with climate collapse. You're a champion of so many human rights causes and communities. I wonder what you think about how we build this kind of compassionate community together, where we can be a kind of, revolution in the 21st century. We're trying to bring together groups across the world into a kind of progressive alliance, internationalist alliance, where we can challenge, when these moments of rupture happen, we can be ready with a progressive movement that's ready to tell a new story. I'm just wondering what your kind of vision of that story is. How do we hold all of these causes together in this difficult moment?
Well, I think you've nailed it in the sense that you've talked about alliances, coalitions, holding it together, bringing people together. That is the crucial thing. Collectively, we are strong. All progressive social change throughout history has been a collective effort. You've had outstanding people like Nelson Mandela or Sylvia Pankhurst or Martin Luther King, but they were figureheads of a movement, a mass movement. And we need to create and sustain that mass movement. And it's got to be a movement based upon hope and optimism, recognizing the pessimistic prescription of what might happen or what will happen if we don't act, but also giving people hope and optimism that things can be changed, that we can change the course of history, that we don't have to accept that climate catastrophe is inevitable, that that hundreds of millions of people in the developing world are hungry and without clean water. We don't have to accept these things, and we can know that by coming together and pooling our resources, we have the strength and capacity to change things. So that's really important. The other part I'd say is that we have to be really careful about making people feel guilty, because when people feel guilty, they tend to, I think, withdraw. So a little bit of guilt maybe is okay, if people are not stepping up to the mark or doing bad things. But we have to don't overdo it, because that tends to turn people off. People need to have a sense that they are welcomed, and that we all have our shortcomings, but that together we can make a difference. And that, if people do, go on a holiday somewhere by airplane, that's not going to be the end of the world. Obviously, reduce it and prevent it as much as possible, but that shouldn't be the focus. The focus should be on, you've had this holiday, now what can you do to make up for it, and how can we together change things for the better? So it all goes back to the themes of hope and spirit, giving people a sense of hope and spirit that things can change. And we know through history that when we organize together, when we stand together, when we put aside our differences, then we can make change.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Peter. A lot of love coming in through the live stream right now. People supporting that message. We're in this together. We've got the 150 of us live right now, the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands now actually across our international movement who are working on these topics. And, personally gives me a lot of strength just to be with you all right now and to hear this kind of, discussing these moral quagmires, and also having this kind of moral discipline to keep going. I love that phrase, the kind of, it can be the pessimism of the intellect, but it's always the optimism of the will. And that really keeps me going. So thank you all so much for tuning in. That's the end of our session now. We're going to have a break until 1:30, and then we've got 2 more sessions that you are very welcome to join to carry on this revolutionary discussion. We've got an introduction to a group called Heat Strike, who are looking at how to organize in working places and other community spaces around having a maximum temperature to work at. Heat strike, declaring national heat strikes to get the climate crisis and workers' rights combined. That's happening at 1:30 with Frida as a workshop. And we've also got another round table with some fantastic speakers like Chris Hedges, the Pulitzer Prize winning author, Matt Kennard from Declassified UK, and Patrick Rainsborough from the Centre for Story-Based Strategy. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm looking forward to seeing you all later, and thank you to our speakers. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.